Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeremy Rasmussen, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. I'll be joined by Michael DeBril, our chief presenter. And our webinar today is Force Majeure Management during COVID-19 Pandemic Recovery. As I mentioned, my name is Jeremy Rasmussen. I'm PTAG's Chief Technology Officer, and I also act as the moderator to our webinar series.
And my name is Michael DeBril. I'm the Managing Director here at PTAG. I'm a project manager by practice and trade for the last 35 years. And I spend a lot of my time working to improve project success outcomes. Specifically, I work with the Construction Industry Institute on a number of their research initiatives, and particularly the integrated industrial project delivery, known as I2PD. Today we're going to go through force majeure and the planning we need to do to be able to return to work. We're now, for the most part, in a second wave in many jurisdictions across North America, Europe, Asia. And as we go through the agenda here today, you'll notice that there's an opportunity for you to input questions down at the bottom of the screen, and Jeremy will moderate those questions at the end of the presentation today. First, a quick safety moment, specific that'll help kind of set this discussion up. Many may know Mike Rowe out there as the host for Dirty Jobs, and he's spent a lot of time ensuring that those jobs are safe. In particular, lately, he's been talking about what he calls his safety third philosophy. And as he explains it, it's not that safety isn't important, but rather safety first can set expectations that somebody else is in charge and cares more about your safety and well-being than you do. And that if you just follow their processes, you will be safe. Well, if you ever get a chance to see one of Mike's videos, particularly this one, he'll explain to you why that's probably not an appropriate way to think about safety. So he talks about safety third rather than safety first. And that kind of sets us up from a safety moment with COVID standards. We've got every city, county, state, and nation have COVID safety protocols. They have guidelines, procedures, standards, regulations, executive orders, and laws in place. And they're designed to help you protect yourself, your employees, and those that you care about to stay safe. And then if an infection does come about, to give you instructions that need to be followed to ensure that you or members of your circle have a chance to recover safely. The challenge is they're not all the same, and they conflict with each other in many places. If you're a news junkie and watch the mainstream news and cable news, you'll be well aware of that conflict. But they do all contain similar elements: PPE, hygiene, sanitation, travel restrictions. But in the end, no government can legislate your safety. Your safety is up to you and the safety of your family and employees. So that's our safety moment. And that kind of sets us up for this force majeure discussion here today. So the new normal requires new ways of operating that requires all parties, owners, consultants, contractors, engineers, equipment suppliers, to find ways to optimize costs and schedule to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and work towards a sustainable recovery. Excusing a party from its contractual obligations for a force majeure event is the exception. Contract liability is strict liability, and as it says there in Latin, contracts are to be kept. Today we're going to talk about three fundamentals that should help in the discussions around force majeure and planning appropriately to return to work, with a focus on looking for opportunities for improvements in these areas. So the three methods we're going to talk about today are transparent communications, intense collaboration and integration, and rigorous change management. We're going to use industry research that's been developed in some cases over decades as we outline these methods to build trust and develop ideas to mitigate the impact of force majeure events. You know, one of the things we've learned with the development of collaborative and integrated contracting strategies is that many brains bring creative ideas to the table that one organization or one individual may not have thought of. So force majeure, usually defined as certain acts, events, or circumstances beyond the control of the contracting parties. Disasters, outbreak of hostilities, pandemics, natural forest fire, man-made forest fires, anything that's beyond the control of the parties under the agreement that is building the asset. One of the key elements of force majeure that the lawyers will tell you about is that there is a continuing duty by both parties in an agreement, or by all parties in a multi-party agreement, to mitigate the impacts of force majeure by proactively taking reasonable steps to mitigate. This can include how to best allocate limited goods, substitute different performance approaches. And what's crucial here is that there's an ongoing and constructive dialogue, setting up a process to continually review and assess the potential steps to mitigate, and then keeping a document record of not only what you did, but the things that you considered and chose not to do. Just like the safety protocols that have been developed in your organizations and on your job sites for COVID, there are existing standard protocols for force majeure events. You know, there's so many past examples. These four are four that I particularly remember and have some personal attachment to. But I'm sure that each of you could come up with 4 or 5 of your own. Globally, the COVID-19 pandemic is something we haven't seen in our lifetimes. The last time there was one of these was in 1916, the Spanish flu that killed, depending on who you listen to, anywhere from 50 million to 100 million people around the world. But from a force majeure, from a law point of view, there's nothing novel about the coronavirus. It's just another force majeure event. You know, certainly the scope of our governments at all levels shutdown of businesses is unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime, causing, you know, just massive disruptions to people's lives, to business supply chains, you know, causing innumerable commercial events to call out their force majeure clauses, in this particular case, their rental obligations, their construction obligations, or engineering obligations, and it can go on, depending on where you're coming from. You know, government shutdown on our ability to work back in March and April, as we all shut down, caused us all to stop and think. But many of us are back to work. we've figured it out to some extent, and here we are now going into a second shutdown. But just because your business and your client or your supplier had to trigger their force majeure events because of COVID, doesn't mean it's something unique and new. Many of us, as I showed in those 4 examples, have experienced force majeure events multiple times in our business careers. And, you know, there is a judicial process. There is a set of known steps that we all need to take. You know, the impacts from particularly from COVID, as it's rolled through society, is that owners have reduced their project management capabilities. Most are now focusing on sustaining and debottlenecking projects. A lot of CapEx has been deferred or suspended or outright canceled. COVID-19, according to Bloomberg, up to 36% of small businesses are at risk of closing and not coming back. From a large company perspective, from an industrial construction point of view, the impact is there. There's a report that came out from Forbes, I think last week, that listed the top 20 large company bankruptcies. And in that top 20, there were 3 in particular that come out of the industrial space. And between them, you know, represent about $20 billion in assets. Construction productivity impacts due to COVID. In many cases, and I'll show you a study in a bit, there's been a significant impact on productivity, but in a few cases, through innovation, productivity has actually gone up. You know, from a construction point of view, social distancing, travel restrictions, and workplace mitigation requirements are probably have the biggest impact. And again, from a construction point of view, employment levels have not fully recovered. Most owners by now, if not all owners, have developed return to work plans for their sustaining and capital programs for those projects that are still moving forward. They follow government guidelines, and again, by necessity, they have to vary by locality. There's different phases. Some places they have phase 1, 2, and 3. Other places they have color codes. The jurisdiction I'm in right now, we're just one step away from a mandatory lockdown. Again, we're in a red phase or a red condition as the second wave begins to roll through this area. In those return to work plans, owners have taken a look at their business priorities, you know, critical issues, critical projects get the highest attention, and normal projects or normal priority-based projects typically have been deferred. In a lot of cases, as businesses look to conserve cash and prop up their balance sheets as we work through COVID. And then the other thing the owners have to keep in mind is their supply chains, their engineers, constructors, their consultants, their equipment suppliers, from an availability point of view and from a viability point of view, as we saw on the previous slide. So as I talked about, we're going to go through 3 key areas in terms of planning to return or planning to re-return as jurisdictions in some places around the world have had to shut down again and are looking to stop projects as they adjust to the second wave. And so transparent communications is critical to working with your vendors, working as a team, working with all your key suppliers, involving all your key suppliers, can make a real difference. And as I talked about, there's a general study out there that I'll show in a couple of slides that shows there's about a 20% impact of construction productivity. But there are other studies out there that show that it's not uniform across all industries, across all regions, and it changes based on the changing conditions and the changing response to COVID. So bringing the right people to the table and clearly putting all the issues on the table and focusing on the issues with frank communications is the first step in looking at ways to mitigate those problems. This is a study I was talking about. It's based on vertical construction productivity, and you can see that productivity dropped from where it was in January down to a low of 22%. And it now looks like, and I'm not sure if I included in this deck, it now looks like that from an industrial point of view and a commercial point of view, productivity is now back up to about, not quite back to where it was, but it's about 6 to 7% below where it was back in January. But in addition to the actual productivity of your craft, we're all now carrying additional requirements that add cost to our projects, and that's the mitigation requires, whether it be safety training, distancing and access rules, administration, cleaning, disinfectant, etc. So there is a real impact, and our ability to talk to each other about those impacts and putting them all on the table from a project point of view is the first step in understanding how the project team can plan to move forward. And it's all about building trust with our mutual duty to mitigate. You know, we need to take a look at all the standard stuff we would look at in planning a normal project, whether it be scope, schedule, work methods, cost, quality, and safety, and looking at what it is we can do applied to those issues to mitigate the impacts on schedule and on the project itself. There is OpEx out there. For those that are savvy with the internet, those that are savvy using Google and Bing and all the other search, those that are members of various associations, those of you that are on listening to this presentation here today, this is a sharing society now in many, many ways, and using OpEx that we've learned from the first round of restarts to where we are now in getting ready or in the middle of shutting down for the second round, taking those lessons, what worked, what didn't work, and applying them will go to a long way to helping us mitigate the impacts because of COVID. So things like priority setting, what's important? Cost, schedule, quality. That's a typical triangle. The schedule's important. The most important, then the way to keep that triangle working together is either something has to give, and that's either cost, additional cost, or quality. Look at the resource availability based on the other parties' priorities and projects. There may be some things that in that transparent communications dialogue that you have, there may be some things that they need that you're in a position to be able to give to make their life easier, not necessarily on your project, but in return on other issues that have been put on the table by all the parties. There may be something where you need a consideration. So by putting all of the issues on the table and looking at it not only through your own eyes, but through the eyes of all your partners on that project, and doing that horse trading, that open and honest horse trading with a view to doing what's right for the project as opposed to what's right for me. We find that that's a recipe for success. There's many opportunities, acceleration opportunities, multiple shifts on break, shifts on lunch, scope changes, scope deferments, deferments of phases of the project. You know, what we're doing here right now, I can tell you, I've gone from maybe one virtual meeting a month pre-COVID to that's how we do our business every day. We're continually online and in these video conferencing sessions. Alternative approaches to work and to the project itself from a technology point of view, more use of drones. One of the things I heard yesterday is what COVID has done with respect to technology in the construction industry is it's in the last 7 months, we've advanced 7 years in terms of adoption. Remote inspections, remote progress, all using technology, whether they be the tablets or smartphones, the drone technology, video conferencing technology, new integrated software. All of that can help in the planning to help mitigate the impact. Work allocation amongst the parties. The ability to shift work. You may have started your project and put it into shutdown, and as you look to relaunch it again, maybe changing who does what is a good idea. And again, if you all put the issues on the table, it's going to help with understanding that. Maybe there's a new approach to tooling, different equipment, construction methods. So looking at the opportunities is a real, and going through a formal approach using tools such as an A3 template from Lean Technology or Lean Construction Institute can help with this. As the issues are on the table, again, focusing on what are the new threats. And there are significant threats out there. Craft, skilled craft, particularly in North America, we're finding skilled industrial electricians are becoming a scarcity. Professionals, equipment and material costs and availability are changing. We're seeing consistently across the board a 5 to 6% increase in material costs across North America, particularly in wood and lumber, and in copper commodities driving construction material costs. And then, what I would consider one of the biggest threats and one of the most difficult things for all of us is the changing regulatory environment. And, it changes. The local jurisdiction that I reside in started out with a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And then about a month and a half ago, we changed to a color coded approach designed to, from a government point of view, to be more precise and not having such a big hammer shutting down a whole jurisdiction, but shutting it down regionally based on what was needed regionally, which is a good thing, but it adds an element of additional planning to the environment we're in. And then rigorous documentation. As you put the issues on the table, as you look at the opportunities, as you look at the threats, and you make decisions with the parties, documenting that, formal minutes, organized documentation that all the parties can have access to or have copies of. is a critical part. That helps build trust. So as you've gone through your discussions, whether like I think Jeremy is doing with this video, and we do with all our seminar series, we taping them, transcribing them, keeping formal minutes, and ensuring everybody has a copy of that. Will go a long way to building trust. And then verify. Open book access to the other party's costs and resources availability. You know, your contract with your suppliers, your constructors, your engineers, maybe that you don't have access to open book, but if they're asking for consideration, that's an opportunity to say, well, that may not be in the contract, but you are asking for consideration. So one of the fundamental ways we're going to move forward here collectively is we're going to either accept a formal change to the contract, and we're going to have open book access, or you're going to do it informally. But you know, trust comes with the right to verify. Okay, so from transparency, and transparency is a necessary ingredient that goes into that recipe for success. From transparency, we set the foundation for intense collaboration and integration. And back in 2015, 2016, the Construction Industry Institute out of Austin, Texas, sat down with industry, and we looked at how we could improve the productivity of industrial projects around the world. And that research published a paper that was published in August of 2018, came out as integrated project delivery for industrial projects. And what it found that as collaboration and integration went up, not only went up in terms of the methods and the principles that were used, but the intensity in which they were used, it found that projects with high levels of collaboration and integration tended to, almost in a linear fashion, tended to be successful. And as you can see, as it went up, there are no failures. There's nothing below this average line here. When you had low levels of collaboration and integration, success was random. So what we have found in advising our clients and working with our clients is that using intense levels of collaboration and integration in a combination with transparency helps set the foundation for all parties to sit down and have that conversation and work through the issues to help mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 under a force majeure clause. I just talked about that. And I think I talked about that. The other thing that we're seeing is this last point talks to it, is that with high levels of CI, collaboration and integration, nimbleness and agility increases, because as problems come up, as regulations change, as we move from shutdowns back to restarts, now back into shutdowns, the teams, the project team, made up of all the parties, are much quicker at putting the issues on the tables, forming the groups that need to be formed, discussing the issues, looking for opportunities to improve, and looking for ways to mitigate risks. So nimbleness and agility increases. Intense collaboration from a CII point of view comes with these 9 principles: 5 collaboration, 4 integration, and they are all supported with these implementation methods here on the right. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is the list of the top 20 implementation methods that support these principles. When this research, when this slide was actually developed, there was 20 of them. Though I think we're now up to 21 or 22. We've added, in particular, advanced work packaging as a implementation method that drives collaboration and integration by bringing the engineers, the constructors, and the owners together from a planning or replanning and of the installation work packages as you restart your projects. There's 5 simple steps to get started from a collaboration and integration point of view. One is select a neutral facilitator. As parties come together, it is not natural for parties to move from what's best for me to what's best for project. And even if the individuals from a particular company are willing to do that, their organization may not be able or willing to do that. So a third-party facilitator helps with that transition in thinking. Define the desired outcomes in restarting the project. Is it all about improving safety? Is it about managing cost? Is it about keeping schedule? Defining the desired outcomes. Assembling that multi-party cross-functional team, and depending on the issue, it's different folks from the different parties. In some cases, it's the engineers. In other cases, it's the project managers. And in many cases, particularly as we're trying to mitigate the impact of COVID itself, it's the health and safety professionals across all the parties. And then develop an action list that's prioritized as you get ready to start. What do you need to have in place? Select the collaboration and integration principles and methods that apply to that project, to those action lists, and to those cross-functional teams. Not all of those principles apply at all phases of the project, and not all of those methods apply. Here's one example. And this comes out of the Lean Construction Institute, and it's all about successfully using the virtual webinar tools, and such as Zoom and WebEx and Teams, and how to use them well. So they talk about as you're building rebuilding your team or selecting new participants on your reconstituted teams, and this was purposely done so it's not all that readable, but when you get the slides, you can zoom in and it's readable, or you can go to the Lean Institute itself and get a copy of the slides. But it's all about interviewing successfully, visually managing your project, as I talked about, using a facilitator, sticking to agendas, creating virtual site walks, using some of the new technology, whether it be laser imaging or drones, the ability to walk a site remotely, so that multiple participants can see that site review from the comfort and safety of their own home or their own offices. What we found in that particular case is we're doing more and more of that. And we'll probably continue to do that in the future, even when we get past COVID, because that means we don't have to send people and have the expense of sending people, or one person can be the eyes and ears for all of us. And now we have the experience in using the virtual technology to be able to do that. Today, turning the cameras on. So you can see Jeremy, you can see me, but we can't see you. What we've found is in our meetings internally, having the cameras on a regular basis builds trust. We humans, we're social, and we get our cues from people's faces and their reactions and the way they hold their body, and that helps us communicate with them. Leveraging breakouts. You may start in a big room environment virtually, but having that ability to break out into sub-teams and come back. Zoom in particular does that well, and the other platforms are coming up to speed. Managing attendance, making sure that people show up. That's as we are separated, many of us have heard, and the doctors are telling us that as social animals, we don't all do well by being socially distanced. And then watch durations. We have some of our meetings that span several days, but by planning agendas right, by taking multiple breaks, by having the breakout meetings, and changing the activities that happen during the virtual sessions, that keeps everybody fresh and attentive. Anyway, one good set of recommendations on how to virtually collaborate. And so the third stool we've got to talk about is rigorous project change management. And this should be, this is nothing new. Yet, even before COVID, it's in so many cases a challenge for so many projects, but particularly now under COVID, there's a duty under force majeure to mitigate, and the ability to keep records and the ability to manage the decisions and the cost and the schedule impacts and the scope and quality and safety impacts are so much easier if you have a rigorous project change management process. First of all, we have to recognize, and again, this is a change management, project change management is a best practice of the Construction Industry Institute. And we have to recognize that change happens on every project for a variety of reasons. And, you know, regardless of the type and magnitude of a change, complex dynamics result as the number of changes increase. So managing those changes and having them organized lessens the impact of that complex dynamics that can result. You know, we talked about the various elements that are subject to change. I can't think of anything on a project in my 35 years, any particular topic, any particular subject, any particular discipline that isn't subject to change. Rigorous change management fully documents changes, and with the tools that are available to us today, not to do that in some automated way, using third-party document management software or using tools such as SharePoint, you know, not to do that just sets us all up for failure. And then just capturing, recording, and agreeing to the changes by type, categorizing your changes as they occur across the phases. You may be in a multi-phase project that was in planning or early execution, had to stop and then plan to restart. And then now, based on your jurisdiction, you're moving into a suspension again. You know, just capturing and recording those changes in an organized manner by each phase. Research has proven that success rates go up. And this is just an image out of the Construction Industry Institute that talks about the various steps that you go through as you move to a best practice way of managing change on your projects. So from a force majeure point of view, there's three change types. First is the performance-related changes that have to do with those changes caused by the performance of you, your suppliers, with respect to your obligations under the project for reasons that don't include COVID. Could be design, could be equipment, could be permits, could be material, equipment changes, whatever it is. You need to manage those changes. You need to record them. You need to categorize them. But these changes have nothing to do with the force majeure event that was triggered because of COVID. But if you don't manage these as well as the COVID related ones and keep them separate, you're going to end up with, you know, the insides of a golf ball, one big ball of layer after layer of rubber windings. Second area of scope change is related to, change is related to scope. We all know that as projects go through the planning phases, we're trying to get all the requirements down on paper and in the requirements documents so the engineers can design them and the constructors can build them. But there's not very many projects out there where life doesn't happen and there isn't a requirement for scope change. And again, these scope changes, again, have nothing to do with COVID-19. Now, that doesn't mean that because of COVID-19, you might not be willing to change scope, reduce scope, alter scope. But here I'm talking about scope-related changes that have nothing to do with COVID-19. Maybe you want to go from, if you're a power plant, from 100 megawatts to 110 megawatts of additional power production. Maybe your refinery, you're looking to tweak the output. Those scope-related changes that have nothing to do with COVID-19, same as before, need to be managed, organized, categorized, ideally using the same system, same change management system, but clearly separated from anything to do with COVID-19. And finally, the force majeure related changes. These are changes that are specific to your project that were caused by COVID-19. We all know that when the pandemic happened, there was 15 days to flatten the curve. Man, have we flattened the curve? We flattened our economy as well in many cases. But the reality is, the changes that came out of those government mandated shutdowns and the ongoing regulatory changes are the ones that we're talking about here. And these are the ones, and a lot of what I talked about earlier applies in terms of transparency and collaboration and integration, can be applied to the other changes. But specifically for today's purposes, we're talking about COVID related. And those include scheduled delays, work stoppage, partial restarts, phased restarts, craft availability, craft training, craft productivity, equipment availability. Not all of these mean that one party or another party is going to get a relief because of these force majeure related changes. But by defining these issues, organizing these issues, and quantifying these issues and putting them on the table, you've at least got a basis to start to have a conversation to resolving the impacts. Think about third-party support resources. Your project managers and other staff from the projects, your project and the other parties' projects typically have a full plate on most projects, just with planning and executing the project that they're on. And so depending on the contracting method, the key project stakeholders have differing motivations. This goes back to, what was your contracting strategy? And it goes back to your ability and your success levels in transparency and integration and collaboration. Experienced third-party resources provide dedicated, neutral, no axe to grind support. They can help you get through that whole force majeure claims change management process. The idea is to maximize mitigation and minimize, if not eliminate, litigation. And these resources can include facilitators, risk specialists, change and claims management experts, commercial and contracts managers. The idea is they can be, depending on your project, they're brought in, they help your project team get past the force majeure related change. so that you can get back on track with the project that you were planning to build. So in summary, force majeure management during COVID pandemic recovery requires the recognition that the impacts are real, they're broad, and it looks like we're going to be feeling them for a while. We all have a duty to mitigate those impacts based on our project agreements, and the agreements and the clauses in the agreements dictate how we approach these. And what I'm hoping to get across to you today, that by transparently putting issues on the table, having a willingness to collaborate and integrate together, doesn't mean the contracts go away, but it means that your collective ability to understand the issues from each other's perspectives gives you a much better chance of finding opportunities and solutions to mitigate those costs. We talked about the 3 methods. And so with that, I am going to turn it back to Jeremy for questions and answers. Jeremy, back to you.
That was great. Thanks, Michael. And thank you, everybody, for submitting your questions. There's still time to submit questions. So as we're chatting here, feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. First question is kind of from about, I think, 5 or 6 slides back. Michael, you had made a comment around construction productivity increases during COVID. And there's a question around that. And
okay.
Frankly,
sure.
I don't remember the exact context, so
yeah.
enough for you to go on.
Yeah, so to be fair, when I first put this presentation together and we delivered the first time in the summer, I wasn't thinking about productivity increases in the construction area, but a recent article that I used for a separate presentation that I'm getting ready to do tomorrow did a survey, and this is a survey that was done in Canada. The surveys I referenced in this particular one, this particular presentation had to do with the North American vertical high-rise market. The survey that led me to make that comment earlier in this presentation was a survey across all construction types. And what it talked to is that not all construction have gone negative in terms of productivity, particularly construction that already had low density work faces, simpler construction methods, seem to see productivity increases. Now, the article didn't talk to why, but me reading between the lines, I'm thinking that with less management and supervision, I'll call it high-level management and high-level supervision on some projects, there's been studies that found that craft and direct craft supervision can actually get more work done with less managers around. So this was a pretty high-level presentation. I mentioned that the fact that there is some productivity increases out there came from that one study, and so that's where that came from.
Good. When we send out a copy of this slide deck, maybe what we'll do is we'll create a link to that study. A couple people are asking for more details on that study, particularly if it was peer-reviewed. And not sure if you know the answer off the top of your head on that, but at least we can provide the link to this.
No, I don't. And so what I'll do is I'm just trying to get back to where I sat, where that writes. Keep going, Jeremy, with the slides.
We've got a number of other questions, so I think we'll loop back on that. We're going to send out an email to everybody with the slide deck and with a link to the presentation, and we'll try to get some information on that article at the time. So we've got about 5 more questions to kind of get through. Carolyn asks, I am the PM of a construction owner's team. What's the best way to motivate our builder to transparently start planning and implementing mitigations? She's concerned that they won't do it and will then come to us too late when there are delays.
So the motivation is the same motivation that motivates you. We're all about being in business this time next year. So it's a motivation about being in business that's going to motivate them. And I don't know your particular results, but if there's a continuing and ongoing relationship there for the next project and the project after that, that's motivation as well. You know, there's a saying that I have 4 kids, and there's a saying I said, I don't forget where I picked it up, and it says, if you expect people to look after their own self-interest, you'll rarely be surprised. And then the codicil of that is every once in a while, you'll be pleasantly surprised. So look to your contractor's self-interest, look to the contract that you have in place with that individual, look to the ongoing relationship, and then invite them to sit down. You're going to get a copy of this presentation, send them a copy of this presentation. Their self-interest should put them in a frame of mind to want to work with you to put those issues on the table. But I think you have to ask, and sometimes you have to ask pretty directly and pretty hard.
I'm going to include Michael's contact information again when I send out those links to the presentation and recording. So if you had feel free to pick up the phone or send him an email if you want to talk about your specific circumstance. Another question here. Person asked if you could just, from the slide deck, could you go back to the summary slide and explain how to include these mitigation items on new contracts? And that may be a little bit more than we have time to get into, but if you could just touch upon that.
Well, here's the thing about force majeure clauses. Many force majeure clauses give the owner a right to cancel the project. You know, there's typically a 30, 60, 90 day where you're waiting to get through the issue. COVID is one of those that is well beyond those typical limits. And so the owners have a right to cancel the project, defer the projects. Cancel a portion of the projects, cancel a particular vendor's scope. So really quick, from an owner's point of view, you have an opportunity to open up that contract. They may not want to do that, but if again, you come out from a point of view of transparency, collaboration, and integration and say, look, we want this project to go forward, but we need to look at these force majeure issues and have a real conversation about them. And you have a duty, just like we have a duty, is to mitigate those costs to each other. And so that's your opportunity right there to be able to put those into the agreement. As you sit down and having those first chats, as you're starting to plan and get the issues on the table. And again, going back to what's in their best interest, it's in their best interest to continue. Under most circumstances. Anyway, hope that helps.
Okay. Another question, one here from Ned. Who usually bears the cost impacts for failing to complete the project by the contractor due to force majeure situation? The owner or the contractor?
In the end, it's always the owner, right? In my experience, in the end, it's always the owner. You know, your contract might be such that there's insurance and that there's letters of credit and there's other tools to be able to recover some of your losses. But at the end of the day, even, you know, if the project doesn't go forward, you know, presumably you wanted that project to go forward for one reason or another. So in my experience, at the end of the day, the owner's always on the losing end of that. And depending on the type of contract and your relationship with your suppliers, you can mitigate that to a great deal. But if it's in an adversarial point of view, after your supplier's gone out of business, what's left, right?
Great. Two more questions, and we've got 3 minutes left, so I think we'll be able to complete right on time. That being said, if you do have any more questions, feel free to still type them in. We will stay on to answer your questions, or we can always commit to getting back to you after the presentation. So here's one from Ken. One issue I've heard about in the safety area is that contractors will attempt to skew their total recordable incident frequency to show a lower incidence of workplace accidents. With COVID, it is imperative for contact tracing that people be as transparent as possible. Has there been any discussion on changing the incentives or evaluation of certain metrics?
So the simple answer from my perspective, I haven't heard that. And with respect to COVID, thoughts of changing the way we do that. And to the broader issue, that's been an ongoing discussion for decades. The lower your safety rating, the easier it is for you to win new business, and hence the motivation to keep your safety ratings down. The challenge with that is eventually that catches up with you. And again, it goes back to that, expect people to do what's in their self-interest. By having an open and honest and transparent relationship with your suppliers, you want to encourage observation. So, there's techniques in the safety world that drives us to what we call predictive analytics, so that, there isn't a penalty for reporting incidents, and that starts with reporting observations. You want to catch those things, report those things, and highlight those things before there's a recordable incident. And that creates the culture of open, honest reporting with respect to safety. So nothing specific I've seen to COVID, but that's an issue that's been around for a while.
Great. One last question, maybe a quick one. Has the proportion of budgets for IT security related risks begun to increase on projects due to connectivity with Zoom or other platforms?
None. And by the way, just for the audience's purposes, my background is computer science. And at one time I was a subject matter expert with respect to industrial cybersecurity. So having said that, I haven't heard anything out of the norm that because we're doing more video, more remote, more cloud-based project management tools and techniques, I haven't heard anything out of the ordinary where the construction industry is subject to any more issues than the rest of the world. Typically, cybersecurity threats come where there's money at the end of the chain for the individual that's perpetrating the crime. And so, yeah, they might be able to do, you might see it from an extremist point of view, trying to disrupt a project that they have some type of axe to grind with. But I don't think that the construction industry is any more susceptible than the rest of society, just because the vulnerabilities, the opportunity to make money is not there as it is in other areas.
Yeah, I would just add on to that to say that I think it's because construction is using these types of tools more than they had before, it's shining a fresh light on this sort of technology, and with that comes more just general security. And as the world's becoming more familiar with using Zoom and tools like that, we're all hearing just as part of the normal conversational vernacular. So I think budgets will shift a little bit as costs aren't being put as much on things like travel, and will kind of come to bolstering up more of the IT-related things that can help projects.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear through the agreements that we're seeing more cybersecurity clauses and agreements that say you, the supplier, to the project have to meet these certain standards, but that was there before COVID, and it was a trend before COVID. And it's clear that even before COVID, that cybersecurity insurance is something that was coming into the construction and engineering industry, and we've all had to carry that. So none of the good practices go away, but nothing specific, because all of a sudden we've gone in 7 months where the industry was expected to go in 7 years in terms of the use of technology. I haven't heard of anything specifically in terms of an uptick in security impacts. And I think that's just because this industry, being late to the party, had some good recipes to follow that other industries have solved already.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And that could be the subject of a totally different webinar. So with that, I'd like to thank Michael. Thank you for a great presentation. Thank you to our audience, some great questions. And everybody enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.